if Attorney Michael Coard, often called the angriest man in America, black man in America, will, I have to say black man in America because you got some other people out there who think they're the angry people in America. But this is a brilliant brother who is looking for justice for everybody. He has a very clear understanding of what it means to be a human being. And I want to introduce him to you at this time. And as I see, I will keep moving forward on the admitting people to our meeting at this time. Okay, Michael Court.
First of all, Dr. Sante, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I certainly appreciate it. And often when I hear people introduce me like you did, singing my praises, it reminds me of the story I tell about the 10 soldiers, including myself, on the battlefield. And we're in the heat of a battle, and the sergeant comes along and says to the 10 of us, hey, I need one of you to take that hill. It'll be a suicide mission, but you'll help us win the battle and eventually win the war, and we'll name a city after you. Sergeant says he's going to turn his back, and when he turns around, he wants to see who the volunteer is. So the sergeant turns his back, turns around, and he sees me standing forward, and he's singing my praises. He doesn't realize is this: I never stepped forward. The 9 cowards stepped back. So when I hear you and others praise me, that's wonderful, but I just look at all the other lawyers and all the other politicians and all the other pastors and all the other professors and wonder not so much why they didn't step forward, but why they stepped back. And I thank you for your kind words, but I just had to throw that in there. And I understand, Dr. Sante, that my presentation, I think you said either 3 or 4 hours, but I'll cut it to 45 minutes, just so everybody can get about their business. But having said that, I really seriously have to thank you, Dr. Sante, for inviting me to be amongst the scholars who speak as part of the Molefe Kete Asante Institute. And it's really interesting when I see myself as part of that group, because I know I really shouldn't be there. I mean, these are legitimate scholars. I just play one on radio and TV, but these are legitimate scholars, and I sincerely thank you for having me as a part of it. The other thing I want to say very quickly is that it's really interesting when, as a so-called lecturer or so-called professor, the people in the class know as much, if not more, than you do. And that's me. As I'm looking around here, I'm like, any one of these persons part of the Zoom could sit right here and do this presentation. That's a wonderful thing. Here's the presentation. As I said, it'll go for about 45 minutes. I believe at like 4:45, 4:50, I'll cut it off and Dr. Sante will allow questions or comments. The topic of today's presentation is a history of resistance. And I'm going to talk about that. But one of the things I always talk about when I talk about resistance, because when we talk about resistance, we're talking primarily about slavery and what we did to overcome it. And that's important. But as I learned from people like Dr. Asante and people like the great Dr. Ed Robinson, anytime we talk about slavery and resistance, we should always throw in excellence and initiative. And what do I mean by that? We always have to remember that slavery is not Black history. Slavery interrupted Black history. We always need to keep that in context, especially when we talk to young people, because I know I went to a great school. I went to Masterman. And during the few times they talked about Black history, it was always starting with slavery. It was always about the civil rights movement. And believe me, I love those folks who fought against slavery and beat it. I love those folks who fought against Jim Crow and beat it. But I didn't know until much later that we had a history beyond that. No disrespect to any other ethnic group, any other peoples, but we're the first. And I'd argue we're the best. Why? Because it seems to me that all the scholars, all the anthropologists point to Africa as the cradle of humanity. 200,000 years ago in the Nile Valley region of East Africa. So we're first. And if we're first, we obviously did stuff first. Mathematics and algebra and calculus and science and astronomy and monotheism and all those things. So I like to throw that out there first so that people don't think that I'm confusing slavery with Black history. Slavery and resistance to it is not Black history. The history of Africans in Africa is Black history. Now, having said that, if I had the ability to play a soundtrack right now, I would play a song from The Last Poets. I like to call myself a hip hop scholar, and I didn't get into hip hop until I first understood poetry and literature and spoken word. And for me, first it was Gil Scott Heron, and then I found out about The Last Poets, and all together in one room at the Asante Institute, I would have you play a song from, I believe it was 1972 from The Last Poets called Before the White Man Came. And that's just such a powerful song because, again, we as Black folks have to stop measuring ourselves by the yardstick of Europeans. That have our own yardstick and talk about all the great things we've done. And that 3 or 4 minute song by The Last Poets, Before the White Man Came, it talks about all the wonderful things we did before our history was interrupted. But I must be clear, it's extremely important, to talk about slavery when we talk about Black history. People say, well, why is that? Because slavery explains our plight today. We're at the bottom of everything: education, home ownership, income, employment. Why are we there? Are we genetically predisposed to be there? Or are there societal ramifications coming out of slavery? So for me, it's important to talk about slavery because it explains our plight. And when we talk about slavery, we begin August 25, 1619. In fact, even before that, we can start with 1492 and Columbus. I'm going to talk about historical resistance, and I'm just going to touch on more recent resistance. Resistance in the form of groups like current Black Lives Matter and the NAACP. And people give the NAACP as much credit as they should, especially folks who I hang out with. I hang out with the hardcore revolutionaries, and we the NAACP and we turn our nose up, not realizing that we're lawyers and doctors and professors and college graduates because of the NAACP and groups like that. So let's not be too damn revolutionary. We got to remember the ladder that we climbed to get where we are. Right now, I can proudly talk about an African-centered socialist. I can talk about that today because the NAACP allowed me to get a great education. The NAACP allowed HBCUs to begin to prosper. The NAACP fought to get people like me into law school and medical school and graduate school. So when I talk about resistance, I'm not just talking about the Black Panther Party. I'm not just talking about SNCC, the hardcore revolutionaries. I'm talking about all of our elders and all of our ancestors who fought the good fight to get us where we are. So we're talking about today, Black Lives Matter. We're talking about the NAACP. We're talking about the Urban League. We're talking about SNCC. We're talking about the Black Panther Party. And we're even talking about HBCUs because for me, that's a form of resistance. I'm sure there were many Blacks before Black folks get into colleges and universities, and they thought the approach was to fight for integration to get into white schools. And that's fine. If that's your approach, that's fine. But for me personally, the better approach was don't act like an abused spouse where you constantly get beat up every Friday night. He apologizes to you on Saturday and you come back on Sunday. No, let's not keep going back. Let's get our own thing. And for me, HBCUs is our own thing. And speaking of HBCUs, some of you might be able to see the shirt I have on. It's actually a shirt with the emblem for my fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi. And I'm wearing this shirt today because on my radio show earlier, we were talking about an event that the Kappas are having on Tuesday. And in connection with that, I had some members of the fraternity. And I thought about taking this shirt off before I did this. Why? Because sadly, many people in these fraternities, many people in these sororities are culturally confused. I mean, we have the luxury of having college degrees, but we still call ourselves Black Greeks. Why do we do that? Why do we call ourselves Black Greeks? The Greeks stole the concept of fraternities and sororities from the people of Kemet, who were doing their rites of passage. And when the Greeks tried to find out what it was, the people of Kemet said it was a mystery. So what did the Greeks do? They called it the Egyptian Mystery School because the people of Kemet wouldn't explain. So my point is, we need to know who we are, and we need to treat ourselves the way we deserve to be treated, with respect. Now, I told you in terms of my presentation today, which is going to go on for about 35 more minutes, I'm going to touch on ancient African history to put it all in context. But speaking of putting it all in context, I had mentioned slavery and talked about how slavery should not be viewed as Black history, but should be viewed as the interruption of Black history. That's all true. But in terms of slavery, let me just say this, because when we look at the plight of Black people today, slavery is real and has an immediate impact upon us. Look at it this way. Let's say you're 50 years old. Okay, this is 2021. So you're 50 years old. That means you were born in 1971. And let's say your parents had you when they were about 30 years old. That means your parents were born in 1941, which means if their parents had them at 30, that means your grandparents were born in 1911. That means your grandparents' parents were born 30 years earlier in 1881. What does that mean? That means your grandparents' grandparents were enslaved. Think about that. You know your grandparents today. Some of them are still living. But imagine that your grandparents' grandparents were in slavery, and they were, if they were born in 1851. So I only mention that just to put it in context. When we think about slavery, we think it was 1,000 years ago. No, if you're 50 years old today, your grandparents' grandparents were enslaved, assuming each of the parents had you when they were about 30 years old. Think about that. And I just said that many people treat slavery like it was 1,000 years ago. Nope. It was 156 years ago, 1865. This is 2021. Do the math. You subtract 1865 from 2021, you got 156 years. And this, talking about putting stuff in context, slavery, legal slavery, I mean, real slavery pretty much went on into the early 1900s. I'll talk about that later. But legalized slavery was from 1619 to 1865. That's 246 years. Think about it. We were quote unquote free since 1865. That's 156 years. We were enslaved for 246 years. That means we were enslaved almost 100 years longer than we've been free. We all need to put this in context because it explains everything. Now, remember I said legal slavery ended in 1865. And I said that because of the 13th Amendment. And I'm going to do my lawyer thing for a few minutes, for several minutes during this presentation, because I want to talk as a lawyer in connection with our history of resistance. So here's how it goes. The 13th Amendment doesn't say what most people think it says. They think it says slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, period. Or slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, exclamation point. Doesn't say either. What it says is that slavery and involuntary servitude are hereby abolished, comma, except following a conviction of a crime. So what happened? White folks in the North sold us out to white folks in the South because the victorious North allowed the South, the defeated South, to put that comma where a period should be. So now once that comma was there in the following clauses, following conviction for a crime, what did the South do? They came up with the black codes. From 1619 to 1865, you had the slave codes. And then when slavery, quote unquote, ended in 1865, you went from the slave codes to the black codes. Well, what are these black codes? The black codes are crimes that involve loitering. Nobody got arrested for loitering before. Crimes like being near a railroad line. Why would that be a crime? Because black people in the South were jumping on trains to get to the North. Crimes like the misdemeanor of stealing a pig. Well, black folks were raised while enslaved on that garbage. No disrespect to the folks who eat pork, but I hope that if you get nothing out of my presentation today, that you stop eating pork, because pork is just garbage. Pigs are one of the few animals on the planet that can't throw up. In other words, they ingest and take in everything, and you eat what they eat. Well, our enslaved ancestors had to eat that. They had to eat hog maws. They had to eat chitlins. They had to eat pig feet. My point is, because they were so, quote unquote, raised on that, once they, quote unquote, got their freedom, they're starving. They're going from plantation to plantation with nothing to eat. They see a pig, what do? They slaughter the pig and they eat it. Well, during slavery, when white folks were stealing pigs, it was a misdemeanor. All of a sudden, when the 13th Amendment comes along, that misdemeanor becomes a felony. What would have been a 50-cent, 75, $2 fine became a felony. So now black folks stealing and eating pigs to survive after slavery were now convicted felons based on something called the Convict Leasing laws. So follow me on this. So 1619, 1865, slavery. And then beginning in 1865, the black codes stemming from the 13th Amendment, which opened the door to the black codes. Because now you got these laws saying black folks who steal pigs are not minor misdemeanors, they're now convicted felons. And I'll talk about convict leasing in a second. Black folks who have nowhere to stay, so they loiter around plantations, now they're charged with loitering. Black folks who try to jump on trains near railroad lines to get to the North are now convicted of crimes. And it's a couple horrific crimes. Let me just tell you in particular. Vagrancy. The legal definition of vagrancy today in 2021 is the same legal definition from 1865, which is being out in public with no visible means of support. So if you're out in public with no visible means of support, you're a vagrant, you're a bum, you're a hobo, you're a criminal. So now you get arrested for that. Well, they're not locking people up for that today. They're harassing people for it, but they're not locking them up. But in 1865, after the 5th Amendment, they were. So black folks obviously were going to be vagrants because they had no visible means of support. They had nothing. 4 to 5 million of them had been enslaved. So all of a sudden you're enslaved, 13th Amendment comes along, and now you're out on the side of the road. The sheriff comes along, pardon my language, and says, what are you niggers doing out here? They say, we just got our freedom from Master Johnson's plantation. The sheriff says, you got a job? No. You got land? No. You got money? No. You got property? No. Well, you're a vagrant. So now you get arrested for vagrancy. The former master comes down to the county courthouse and pays off your fine. You got to go back to the master's plantation to work off that fine. That's 30 days, that's 60 days, that's 90 days. And once you work off the fine that he paid for you, now you're back on the side of the road and it all goes around again. Now you notice, well, I'm going to get to convict leasing in a second, but I told you about several laws, part of the black codes. I talked about the pig laws. I talked about the railroad laws. I talked about the vagrancy law. It was also a law, believe it or not, called the White Women Yelling Law. That was the name of it, the White Women Yelling Law. In other words, if a black man raised his voice in the presence of a white woman, she could have him arrested. Think about that. If a black man, these are laws. I'm talking to you as an attorney. I'm telling you that some state legislature, I'm telling you that some city council sat down, wrote out these laws, thought about these laws, passed these laws, and then made them laws. This wasn't some back alley trailer park guy who just came up with this. These were the best and the brightest of white folks, white lawyers, white legislators who passed laws like that. The law that said that it's a crime for black men, not for black men to threaten white women, not for black women to intimidate white women, not for black men to terrorize white women, but for Black men simply to raise their voice in the presence. I, as a Black man, could be yelling to my brother across the street, telling him to hurry up. And if a white woman is nearby, she can have me arrested. That's America. These are American laws. So remember, 1619 to 1865 slave codes. And then we so-called get our freedom, but not really with the 13th Amendment. And out of the 13th Amendment comes the Black codes, some of the laws I just explained to you. Out of that comes convict leasing. Remember, I just told you that Black folks recently enslaved, side of the road, get arrested for whatever, vagrancy, loitering, whatever. They get arrested, taken to the county courthouse, can't pay the fine. Former master comes along, pays off the fine, and they got to go back to the plantation to work off that fine. Well, the city, the county, and the state realized, hey, why are we letting the former master do this? Why don't we come up with something called convict leasing? And that way we can arrest all these formerly enslaved Black people, and then we can give these the long prison sentences and then lease them out to the former tobacco plantation, the cotton plantation, the coal mine. And that went on for a very long time. In fact, up until the 1900s. So don't tell me slavery ended in 1865. There's a documentary on PBS, Channel 12, WHYY, called Slavery by Another Name. It's free on YouTube and it's free on WHYY PBS. I was about to say, I encourage you to watch that video called Slavery by Another Name, but I'm not sure if you should, because I stumbled across it maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Couldn't go to sleep, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was on fire. I had to be in court that next day. And I had just watched Slavery by Another Name and then had to go into court, and my head just wasn't right. I'm not going to tell you what I was planning to do because I don't want to get arrested. And if I tell you all, I'll have to kill you. So I'm not going to tell you what I was going to do. But that documentary got me fired up, and it will get you fired up. You got to watch it, Slavery by Another Name. And it explains that what happened after 1865 up until the mid 1900s was just that, slavery by another name, because of those Black codes, because of convict leasing. And then we had sharecropping. Sharecropping was the worst racist fraud in American history. Now you go back to the former master's plantation and you figure, okay, I'll work here now. Okay, sounds like a fair deal, but you don't work there. You slave there. Why? Because after your 30 days, remember, slavery's ended. Your 30 days, you go back to the former master, hey, I worked 30 days from whatever, July to August. I'm here for my $50 for the month. And the former master says, okay, you're right, $50. But what about the seeds you use? We got to deduct $10. What about my shovel that you use? We got to deduct $5. What about my property that you slept on? We got to deduct $10. By the time it was over, that $50 that the sharecropper was supposed to get winds up being about $75 that he or she owes to the former master, which means now that person got to work longer. And if that person doesn't work longer, sheriff comes along and arrests him. So again, don't tell me that slavery in terms of that oppressive racist system ended in 1865. And then we go to Jim Crow. Well, Jim Crow to a large extent still exists today. People talk about, well, didn't Brown versus Board of Education, the US Supreme Court decision of 1954, didn't that end Jim Crow in the schools and everywhere else? Yeah, but no. Many people don't know, but there was a Brown 2, there was a Brown 3, and there was a Brown 4. The Brown 4 decision was as recently as 1998. And in that 1998 case, the courts agreed that we still haven't fully implemented the Brown versus Board of Education decision from 1954. Think about that. People thought it was, oh, happy day. Black folks going to get the greatest education after that decision, but no. As of 1998, and I double check every time I speak to folks to see if it still has been completely implemented. If Brown has, it has not been, and this is 2021. I got about maybe 20 minutes left and I'm going to stay on track. I got so much to share with you. I got to cut some of it. You know, when I talk to Black folks and even woke white folks, when I talk to audiences, I used to believe that with the best, most logical, most coherent argument, I could persuade people to do the right thing, especially Black people. Now, when I say persuade them to do the right thing, I'm not saying you got to do everything I tell you to do, but I am telling you, you can't be a Black face on white supremacy. You can't be a Trump supporter. You can't be a Republican. You can't be anything that undermines the advancement of Black people. So I used to think that if I came in with the most historically sound, the most logically strong argument, then I can get the masses to go the direction that the ancestors have led me to go in. But I realized that that's not going to happen. That's never going to happen. I mean, I tell people today that Thurgood Marshall is the only Black man who's ever been on the Supreme Court. People say, don't you know your history? Why do you say Thurgood Marshall? Because the other guy, no, the other guy is not Black. Because for me, you're not Black based on your skin, you're Black based on your consciousness. John Brown was Black as a white man. Clarence Thomas was not, is not. So, and there's a lot of Clarence Thomases out there. There are a lot of Trump supporters who are Black out there. There are a lot of Black Republicans out there. And I realized that I'm never going to get them. And then, I don't know, about 10 years ago, I stumbled across a quote by the great Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And what he said turned the light on in my head to make it clear why I don't have to try to get the entire Black masses to move forward. The Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey said this, quote, "I have no desire to take all Black people back to Africa. There are Blacks who are no good here and likewise would be no good there." I'm like, whoo, drop the mic, Garvey, because that's exactly what it's all about. So we as Black people, I would love to say we can build this mass army of all of our people, but we can't. So we got to go to war with the army that we have. And I want to be clear. I'm not dictating to any Black person that they must go the way I go, that you got to be an Afrocentric, Pan-African socialist. No, you can be a capitalist. You can be whatever you want as long as you put the agenda of Black people forward. As long as you fight the good fight on behalf of Black people. And again, I'm going to skip some of the stuff I wanted to talk about because we don't have enough time. And I know Dr. Sante wants to get to a question and comments at about 4:50. So I see here I got 17 minutes left and I'm going to stay on track. Back around in the mid 1800s, there was a white surgeon, a white psychologist who actually got one of his degrees from University of Penn. His name is Dr. Samuel Cartwright. And Dr. Samuel Cartwright came up with this concept called Drapedomania. Drapedomania. What is Drapedomania? Drapedomania is what Dr. Samuel Cartwright said is a mental affliction affecting Black people who want to resist, affecting Black people who want to escape slavery, affecting Black people who want to run away. Drape comes from the Latin phrase or the Greek phrase, runaway. Mania means madness. So if you want to run away, you're mad, you're crazy. If you want to resist, you're mad, you're crazy. Well, I must be mad and I must be crazy because I want to resist. And it's my opinion that everybody who participates in these Zooms by you, Dr. Sante, want to do the same thing. Again, I'm still on track. I got about, I don't know, maybe 12 minutes, 13 minutes left. When we talk about resistance, because I really want to save times for law-related resistance, let me just fly through this. When we talk about resistance, we can include a whole bunch of stuff in terms of historic movements by Black folks and woke white folks. We can talk about 1712 with the New York slave revolt, where about 25 Black folks rose up. We can talk about 1739 and Jemmy and the Stono Rebellion with more than 100 Black folks rising up. We can talk about the multiracial, multiracial New York conspiracy in 1741 with more than 100 folks actively involved. We can continue and talk about 1800 with Gabriel Prosser. And by the way, when I told you about that quote from Marcus, the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, he was talking about the two Black folks who snitched on Gabriel Prosser. The reason that Gabriel Prosser got caught is because two Black people ran back to Massa. It wasn't because of some white folks, it was Black folks who did it. Let's fast forward to 1811. In New Orleans, they called it the German Coast Uprising, headed by Deslandres. And he had what many historians to this day say was the largest quote unquote slave revolt in American history, with anywhere from 124 to as many as 300. Charles Deslandres with the German Coast Uprising in New Orleans. That's 1811. Again, we're talking about resistance. We got to include him. Then we fast forward to 1859. John Brown and the Harper's Ferry raid. And by the way, John Brown, one of the greatest human beings in world history. But it wasn't just him. It was actually 15 other white folks who joined him, including some of his sons. But many people forget about the 5 Black men who stood with John Brown. Let me call their names out. There was 29-year-old Osborne Perry Anderson, who, by the way, was one of the few who escaped. He escaped, fled to Canada, and came back to fight in the Civil War. There's also John Anthony Copeland Jr., along with Shields Green. In addition, Lewis Sheridan Leary and Dangerville Newby, Black men standing shoulder to shoulder with John Brown. And by the way, there was a Black guy on a train coming through Harper's Ferry who saw what John Brown and the Black folks and his comrades were doing. And the Black guy on the train used a telegram and alerted the authorities. And that's how John Brown got caught. Think about that. A white man got caught because a Black man snitched on him. Many historians, Herbert Aptheker and others, say that there were hundreds of slave revolts. And we got to be careful when we say that, because when they talk about slave revolts, they define it in a certain way where there's at least 50 or 100 persons who take up arms. That's true, and that certainly would be a revolt, but putting poison in Massa's milk is also resistance. Slapping the hell out of his abusive son is also resistance. So from my standpoint, yeah, we have documented at least 313 active, notable slavery revolts, but it's much more than that. Because I'm running out of time, I wanted to list about maybe 10 to 15 of the revolts that took place long before what happened here in America. There were Africans in the motherland who stood up against the Europeans, who stood up against the Portuguese. If there's a devil coming out of Europe, it's the Portuguese. I mean, we got Portugal, we got Spain, we got England, we got all that stuff. But if you want to talk about the source of the wickedness, the source of the evil, that European is from Portugal. And my point is, when I talked about the people I talked about, and by the way, I almost forgot, I can't forget Nat Turner, not only because of who Nat Turner was, but many people don't know that Nat Turner's paternal grandmother was a Coromantee. And the Coromantee is from the Akan subset. And the Coromantee was so rebellious, was so resistant, was so revolutionary that there was a law proposed in Virginia to prohibit the importation of any Coromantee. That's the bloodline. That's the bloodline of Nat Turner. And it was his grandmother who, 13 years old, kidnapped, brought to America, but she was part of that Coromantee bloodline. I got so much more I want to talk about that, regarding that, and regarding ancient African warriors, men and women, ancient African military generals. So the Nat Turners, the Gabriel Prossers, the Denmark Vessies, the Harriet Tubmans, the Soldier of Truth, they weren't the first to rise up. That resistance was pumping through their veins from their ancestors in ancient Africa, even before the 15th century BC, when the warrior pharaoh Hatshepsut did what she did. So our ability to resist and fight back is nothing new. And very quickly, I got about 10 minutes left. It's 4:40. Let me get to what I really wanted to focus on, coming in as a lawyer. It's really funny because I tried to avoid calling myself a lawyer. Instead, I refer to myself as an attorney. People say, well, why do you do that? I'm like, it's no big deal, but here's why. I'm one of the few attorneys that don't look to the law as the be all and end all. Because for me, the law is simply rules created by the haves against the have nots. Because think about it, slavery was legal. Apartheid in South Africa was legal. The Holocaust in Germany was legal. Women not being able to vote was legal. Children being forced to work in the coal mines 20 hours a day was legal. So don't tell me about the law, tell me about justice. That's why I refer to myself as an attorney. And in connection to my role as an attorney for the next 9 minutes, let me just talk about some law-related events that resulted in resistance and ultimately victory, or at least the battle toward victory. We begin in 1619, August 25, 1619, the birth of American slavery as we know it. Yeah, we know America wasn't officially founded until 1776, technically not until 1789 with the drafting of the Constitution, but for our intents and purposes, slavery in America as we know it began on August 25, 1619. And what was the law for Black people? The law for Black people was slave codes, the slave codes. So our introduction to the American legal system was racist slavery legislation. Let's fast forward to 1704. Many people don't know that today's municipal police departments are the great-great-grandchildren of the so-called slave patrols, because it was in 1704 in the colony of Carolina that a law was passed to deputize any white male age 21 or older to do whatever he or she, not she, to do whatever he wanted to enslave Black folks. You want to beat them up? Beat them up. You want to lynch them? Lynch them. You want to raid their slave quarters? You do that. The same thing that cops do to Black people in 2021, the birth of the American policing system in the colony of Carolina in 1704 allows that. Let's fast forward from, so again, 1619, law, racist brutality. 1704, law, racist brutality. Fast forward to the fundamental law of the land, the US Constitution, adopted in 1789. Well, you might think that was a wonderful thing. Well, not really. Why? Because that same Constitution included the 3/5 clause. And people might say, well, come on, Mike, 3/5 clause, wasn't that a good thing? Because really it was designed to dilute the impact of the South, because the South was counting its enslaved population as citizens. So let's say Mississippi might have, let's say for the sake of discussion, 1 million white folks and 1 million enslaved Black folks. So Mississippi would say they got 2 million folks. So if they got 2 million folks, they get a bigger representation in Congress. And the North said, no, you can't count the enslaved population because you don't give them any rights. Instead of the North sticking to its guns and telling the South, you can't include the Black people unless you give them rights, the North folded. They gave in, they caved in. They said, all right, we won't let you count them for 100%. We'll give you 3/5. In the Constitution, we go from the 3/5 clause of the US Constitution to the runaway return clause. What did that say? A clause in the Constitution said, if you're in a slave state, a slave colony, a slave territory, and you escape to a free state or free colony or free territory, then that free state, that free colony, that free territory under the US Constitution has to send you back into slavery. That's the runaway return clause. There's also the 20-year extension of the importation of quote unquote slaves. What does that mean? I got to wrap this up in 5 minutes. So folks, you got to follow me quickly because I'm going to be speaking quickly. What does that mean? It said in 1789 with the drafting of the Constitution that 20 years after that, 1808, from 1789 to 1808, 20 years, that during that time period, white folks under the Constitution can continue to bring in Black folks from Africa to enslave them. So in 1789, the founding fathers said, well, this slavery thing is bad. Maybe we should stop it. Yeah, we will, but 20 years from now. And check this out. They didn't say they were going to end slavery in 20 years in 1808. They said they were going to stop importing Africans into slavery. So even though they stopped bringing Africans in 1808, there were more enslaved Black folks after 1808 than before. You might say, Mike, you must be wrong. How could that be? If they stopped importing Africans in 1808, how can they have more enslaved Africans after 1808? It's very simple, because slavery is the spawn of the devil. It's devilment. It's one thing to see a man, to capture a man, and enslave a man. It's one thing to see a woman, capture a woman, and enslave a woman. But to get those people and force them to copulate in order to birth an enslaved person is the height of wickedness and devilment. Who does that? Who actually breeds human beings to be enslaved? That's why there were more enslaved Africans in America after 1808, when the importation stopped, than it was before then. Very quickly, I got 4 minutes left. Then we fast forward. Well, the other part that I'm just going to touch on, in addition to the 3/5 clause, the runaway return clause, the 20-year extension, is the Electoral College. You know all about that now. Fast forward from 1789 to 1857, Dred Scott decision, which basically said that Black folks have no rights that white folks are bound to respect. Then we jump to 1873, and I hope folks are writing this stuff down, because this is stuff that should be known. This is stuff that law schools and law professors and lawyers should talk about, but they don't. Let's fast forward from 1865 to 1873. Remember I told you about Dred Scott? That was 1857, but there was a case in 1873, nearly 20 years later, called the Slaughterhouse Cases. Google the Slaughterhouse Cases out of New Orleans. The Slaughterhouse Cases of 1873 strengthened the Dred Scott decision from 1857. Think about that. As bad as Dred Scott was, the Dred Scott decision was strengthened nearly 20 years later in 1873 with the Slaughterhouse Cases out of New Orleans by the Supreme Court. Fast forward to 2013. 2013 was the Shelby County versus Eric Holder case. You can say what you want about President Barack Obama. He certainly wasn't the savior I had hoped he would be, but he did some good stuff. One of the things he did was to force the South to abide by the Voting Rights Act of 1865. Well, the South didn't like that. So Shelby County, Alabama, filed a lawsuit against Barack Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, saying that we ain't got to abide by no damn Voting Rights Act of 65. And the US Supreme Court in 2013 agreed. There's something, we don't have enough time to talk about, something called the pre-clearance. That means if you're a state, you have a history of violating Black voting rights, before you can go ahead with your state elections, you got to show the federal government what you're doing and get a pre-clearance before you can make it official. But these southern states said, we don't need no damn pre-clearance. We decide what to do with our Black folks. The US Supreme Court in 2013 said, you're right. So in 2013, in the Shelby County versus Eric Holder case, the US Supreme Court destroyed, gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was killed in 2013 by the US Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder. In my final 2 minutes, 2016, you got to Google a case called Kansas Solicitor General Hodes, H-O-D-E-S, versus Schmidt. Kansas Solicitor General Hodes versus Schmidt in 2016. Not only was the Dred Scott decision of 1857 strengthened in the Slaughterhouse Cases of 1873, but the Dred Scott decision has never been overturned by the US Supreme Court in history. We know that with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that overruled the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Plessy versus Ferguson was an 1896 case which basically said Jim Crow is good. Separate facilities for Blacks and whites, that's good. That was the Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. But then in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education said, no, that's not right. So the Supreme Court overturned Plessy. But no Supreme Court has ever overturned the Dred Scott decision. In fact, in 2016, just 5 years ago, the top lawyer in the state of Kansas in a legal brief supporting an unrelated issue, that top lawyer cited the Dred Scott decision to support his argument. When we lawyers go to court, we don't just argue ABC. We argue ABC and tell the judge that this ABC came from a case that is a precedent from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago. Well, that's exactly what the Kansas Solicitor General, guy by the name of Hodes, that's exactly what he argued in his case in 2016. He was a racist lawyer, but he was a smart lawyer because he was right. Dred Scott has never been overturned. And you might say, what about the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th? That's legislative, that's congressional. I'm talking about the judiciary. They never did the right thing. And finally, folks, I got 3 or 4 other points I want to make, but here's what I'll say at the end. I laid out the problem, talking about Black resistance, our history, and I got much more. So who knows, maybe I'll come back in a few months or a few years to finish this through part 2. But I want to wrap this up with some solutions. We talked about resistance. How do we continue to resist? We continue to resist in my final 1 minute by taking a page out of the book of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass in 1867 said this. Now he said man's, but I'm going to include women. This is what he said. A man and a black man's woman, a black man's and a black woman's rights rest in 3 boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. That's what Frederick said in 1867. A man, a black man's and a black woman's rights rest in 3 boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. That's my message for you all. That's how we continue to resist. But with all due respect to the great Frederick Douglass, I'm arguing a 4th box. What's that 4th box? That's what I call the toolbox. What's the toolbox? The toolbox is where you keep tools. And for us, tools are books. Books written by people like Dr. Asante, books on the list by ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. Find some African-centered scholars writing some African-centered books, and they are the tools for our success. So the updated version is this: a black man's and a black woman's rights rest in 3 boxes, in 4 boxes: the ballot box, the jury,
Dr. Ben,
the cartridge box, and the toolbox. Dr. Asante, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. And Michael, if everybody could, I mean, I'm sure they would. They can, they would applaud this incredible presentation. You've given us facts. You've given us history. You've given us insight, I mean, as you always do. And I am sure that there are a number of people who have questions, but unless you are asking a question, we're going to ask you to remain mute. And I just would like to say this, that Michael, last year, and I may not have announced this, but last year, I'm saying this just because you mentioned about the Kappas. Last year, I became a member of Kemet, which is the African fraternity out of Morehouse. And I went through my initiation last year, and I felt very relieved and very liberated by doing that. And I haven't shared it with many people, but it was a great experience, and it was a wonderful kind of thing. I wanted to just.
And I'm glad you shared that, Dr. Asante. That's another example of the proof that you are an African, not a Greek.
That's right. Absolutely. Thank you very much. And then I just wanted to, I mean, there's so many things to say. You took us to so many places in terms of our history. And one of the things that struck me was the great nobility of the African people in America, but also you showed us about the rest of the world. But there has always been resistance, whether it is Yanga in Mexico or Zumbi in Brazil or Nani in Jamaica. Everywhere, Black people have said, this is not the history of Black people, you see? And I appreciate that very much, and I'm really delighted. So we're going to open the floor up The last time we opened the floor up for you, Michael, I remember we had some Trump supporters. I don't think we have any more here. I hope not. But
Actually,
so I'll.
I hope we do, but that's neither here nor there.
Okay, but at any rate, we will. I'll open the floor now. And can I see anybody who is there a hand? Is there a question?
Yeah, it's not that I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question.
I want to ask Michael to address the battle that's going on now, so-called critical race theory, the response of the right against the 1619 Project and other types of efforts by Black people to tell the truth. So just comment on that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Brother Junius. Thank you very much. For those who don't know, critical race theory is basically this. Let's start telling the truth about America. That's what they should call it. In fact, they got a branding problem. Instead of calling it critical race theory, they should just call it the truth about America.
Absolutely.
And Americans hate that notion. So I got to tell you, I'm not really surprised at the pushback by white America against the critical race theory, because anytime you're exposed, you become defensive. And the critical race theory exposes the racist history of the United States of America. So when I hear this white racist pushback and the denial of tenure for the woman who's the force behind the concept, I can't say I'm surprised, because as my grandfather used to say, what do you expect from a pig but a grunt? So they're grunting the way they expect it. What I hope, Brother Junius, is that Black folks rally around the proponents of the critical race theory. If our enemy is raising hell to destroy it, we got to raise hell to uplift it. And I'm so glad you mentioned that.
I really appreciate that answer. If I could say this, Michael, I also wish we had enough conscious African American people in positions of influence, like provosts,
yes,
and vice presidents. And I wish for the day that my university would say to Nicole Hannah Jones,
yes,
the lady who was denied tenure at North
yes,
Carolina, come to Temple. We'll give you tenure. That's what I would love to see, because that shows consciousness, you see.
And the fact that they refused tenure, she has the best resume
Absolutely
in the history of tenure applicants anywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But anyway, next question.
Yeah, this Farouk. Can you hear me?
Dr. Farouk, go right ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Other than Amistad, Brother Michael, can you name any other slave revolts on ships, on slave ships?
Are you just talking about slave revolts, period, or slave revolts that result resulted in judicial decisions?
No. Slave ships. In other words, other than Amistad, can you name me any other slave revolts on slave ships?
The short answer is no. The short answer is no. A longer answer would be that many scholars indicate that there were at least 313 major slave revolts. And to be quite honest, I don't know if on slave ships are included in those 313. I don't know.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Next question.
But that was a great question. So much so, as soon as the Zoom ends, I'm going to find out.
Yeah, there was at least one other one, and I was trying to remember the name of it. I can't remember the name of it right now, but there was at least one other one other than the Amistad, whose name escapes me as well. All right. Is there another question? Okay.
Dr. Sonny, this is Sharon.
Sharon,
to answer Dr. Farouk's question, AAGG, if you're familiar with them, Diane Sheldon, she's having a webinar on slave ships.
Okay.
AAGG.
All right. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. There is one. Is that gallery? Gallery 810? Is that a question? No. Yes. All right. So I think, did I get everybody? I don't want to make sure. Are you unmuted?
Hi, my name is Marvella. I just want to say thank you, Michael Coard and Dr. Ashante, for having this Zoom. And I hope that I could join into more things that you have. I received an email, and that's why I came in. And it's great as ever. Michael Coard is on point all the time.
Absolutely.
But thank you both very much.
Thank you very much. And we will try to have, I mean, Michael is so busy, but we would try to have him at least 2 or 3 times a year, because he is always a bringer of truth, and we really appreciate him so much.
Dr. Sante, this is Eltra Alexander. I would like to thank you and thank Michael Coard for your lecture today. It was superb. Between you and so many others, as we also do love Dr. Smith, your lecture was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we love Dr. Smith too. Dr. Smith is a professor at our department, and we really appreciate him. And you will be hearing from a number of other outstanding people. You know, some of them, I think maybe at the next lecture, I will have a new list for you. But coming up now on June the 13th. Yes, on June, just 1 minute. On June 13th, I want you to write this down, then I come right back to you. On June 13th at 4 o'clock, the ID number is 840-6175-858. Remember that, 840-6175-858 at 4 p.m. on June 13th. Tell all your friends, because the outstanding, dynamic Dr. Joyce King is going to be talking about how to overcome disconscious racism. Dr. Joyce King was the leader of the largest educational research association in the United States of America, the AERA, to get to be the top person, the president of the AERA, which includes thousands of educational researchers in this country and even around the world. You have to be great. Dr. Joyce King is great. She's a great scholar with a number of books and articles. She's a major influence in the educational world. She was a former provost at Spelman. She's a distinguished professor at Georgia State University, and she was a colleague of Dr. Asa Hilliard. She's awesome, and of course knows about Africa, Europe, Asia, United States. So just remember, Dr. Joyce King, one of the greatest scholars that we have living today, will be here on June 13th at Zoom 840-6175-858. And I would like for you to make sure that you will notify your friends about this on an email. All right, that is a very important thing. Now go right ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sante. Joyce Johnson,
Dr. Joyce, thank you, Joyce.
Family of the Institute. I was wondering if Michael, now that we have maybe a couple minutes and some closing comments, some of those points he said he left out, if he could just kind of summarize some of that stuff and
I mean, you know what? I'm a speaker, and if I'm a speaker, one of the things Dr. Joyce This is not just George King. This is another George.
Right, there's another George.
But I know, but George, well, one of the things I just don't like for when speakers have to do that again. I think he's done what he wants to do, but I'm gonna let him do. He can decide.
I have a question. I want to know what steps can we take to help Nicole Hannah Jones, and how can we assure that the George Floyd bill is passed and the voting rights bill?
Michael?
Yeah, I'm prepared to answer that, but I wanted to get to the first person first,
right, George.
Then get to the second. It's a couple things. One, I was going to talk about the Mau Mau, which is more correctly known as the Land and Freedom Army. Their approach to resistance and revolution is technical. And I don't have time to get into it, but I would just encourage folks to Google the Mau Mau, better known, correctly known as the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya, to Google their Oath of Unity. Their Oath of Unity is a 5-point strategy to resistance and revolution. And it's very, very strong. I was going to get into each of those 5 points. We don't have enough. And the other thing I was going to do, and thank you for asking me, I encourage everybody to watch a powerful documentary on HBO entitled Exterminate All the Brutes. That is one of the most compelling documentaries I have ever seen in my life. It's so powerful, I cried and couldn't watch the second episode back to back. In fact, I actually have to take about 2 or 3 days between each episode. It's painful, it's ugly, it's horrific, but it's factual and it's motivating. It's entitled Exterminate All the Brutes, a 4-part series on HBO. And folks don't know what I'm talking about. Just Google Raoul Peck, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So to the person who just asked, Mau Mau and Exterminate All the Brutes. And Dr. Asante, I'll defer to you as to what could be done to help a professor deny tenure.
I'm sorry. There was somebody interrupt. There was a mute. There was an unmute that I missed your last point.
Oh, not a problem, because I answered the previous caller's question about what I didn't get a chance to talk about. That was the Mau Mau, and it was about the documentary. But I want to turn over to you, the last caller's question about what can we do to help the professor whose tenure was denied.
Well. Thank you very much for that question. I think that there really isn't much for us to do as lay persons on that. I mean, really, I remember Derek Bell, when he was an attorney and a professor at Harvard, he basically, over the issue of tenure for an African-American woman, simply said, you know, if you don't give her tenure, then I'm resigning from Harvard. And I think that within the academic institutions and within the University of North Carolina, we can certainly raise our voice and send some objection to it. But in a university like the University of North Carolina, I'm sure that there are systems and people in place that they will perhaps retain that kind of thing. But I'm not sure if Valerie Harrison is here today, or Joyce King maybe could tell us more, because they've been into the institutional, the higher offices. I'm not sure. But I think
Dr. Harrison would be perfect. I mean, as an academic, as an administrator, as an attorney.
Yeah.
I'm here, Dr. Asante.
Okay, so George, what can we do anything to help the person who's been denied tenure at the University of North Carolina, Nicole Hannah Jones, who did the 1619 project?
I've been really biting my tongue, so let me see how I can, in very few words, say something about this. I think we have to realize that this war that we're in, this intellectual war that we're in, is designed in many ways to be a distraction. And we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're not looking at when we run after what other people hold up for us as what the battleground should be? No shade against the sister. She did a wonderful project with the New York Times. But as the brother Michael Coard said, We have a problem when we start our story with slavery. So this is a powerful piece of work, but if you read carefully what the sister has put together, it's founded on an old idea that we have left nothing in, that our identity is not an African identity. Now, you have to read it carefully and you will see that that's where she starts. So the fact that the New York Times has lifted this up, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is it in it that is benefiting other people? Our history did not start in the New World in 1619. You have to go to 1500s in Florida, where there was enslaved people and free communities. So we've been given a fight that really isn't our fight. And I am sympathetic that the sister didn't get tenure. I've been denied tenure myself. So it's a very hard thing. But they have created a false flag for us to run after, and it is not really the problem. The problem that we might want to pay attention to is all these laws that are being implemented across the country
Right.
to prevent the teaching of historical truth across the board. So one person is not the problem. And again, I'm not saying anything to diminish the power of the work that the sister did, but it represents a perspective that has a flaw in it.
Okay.
And if you read the beginning essay, you will see that she's saying we're not African.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Joyce King. That's going to be our speaker in June. And so you know we're ready for some fire. That's wonderful, wonderful. And we appreciate that answer. Once again, I just want to say, I noticed also on our Zoom today, we had Dr. Al Sutton, who's been working with me for about maybe 15 years almost now on the Sudan question. And hopefully on one of these occasions, we'll have him to give us an update on the Arab racism against the Black people in Sudan. That's an issue that also needs to be brought to the front. And I must give Al Sutton credit for the work that he has done on this. And he's been at our institute. He's been at the MKAI Institute on several occasions. And we will probably reach out to him to just give us an update on the Sudan question. But thank you, Dr. Joyce, and thank you, Attorney Michael Coard, for this incredible session today. And we really appreciate all of you, and keep a lookout for our next session, which is going to be with Dr. Joyce King. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Dr. Sante.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
This is Bingley Santa, third.
Yes. Go right ahead, sir.
You told me to get back with you about that book.
Oh, was that a book of names or something?
No, it was the book called Herodotus of Egypt.
I'm sorry.
It's called Herodotus of
Egypt.
Yes,
Herodotus on Egypt. Yeah, I found a copy. The thing is that I may have to print a copy for you. Did you call me? Do you have an email? Did you email me too, so I can send it to you through email or something?
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, just Emma Sante, Masante, Emma Sante at temple.edu.
Hey, Dr. Sante?
Yes, sir. Okay, Mr. Africa, Brother Stan.
I just want to say thank you and the great Michael Coard for sharing. And I'm always excited when I hear you two brothers. And I wanted to close out by saying this is the 46th year of Adun Day, June 6th to the 13th. And we'll be celebrating it virtually. And on June 11th, we're having the African Business Roundtable virtually with the ambassador from Mali, the ambassador from Sierra Leone, the Ivory Coast, and one of the leading executives from the Sudan to discuss several projects. So I'll make sure I get this to you, Doc, Dr.
Right.
Sante, and maybe you can send it to you in the mailing list, okay?
Okay, that's fine. This is going to be here in Philadelphia. The June, but it will be a Zoom, so it'll be all over the world. Everybody on this, we could send it out maybe to the mailing list. Thank
Dr.
you.
Sante,
Yes.
Thank you.
give us the number for our next lecture in
Yes, the number for the next lecture, which will be on June 13th, is 840-6175-858. And that's Dr. Joyce King.
right. Okay, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. You guys are wonderful, and it's a great audience and a great family. Appreciate you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Sante.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everyone have a blessed day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
all. Asante Sana.
Sante.
Okay. Seeker too, Joyce.